Senator Elizabeth Warren has been credited with leading the charge on progressive policy ideas in the 2020 Democratic primary. She just released a plan that tackles the debate about responsible capitalism in a new way. She's calling it economic patriotism. Now, the plan combines industrial policy with environmentalism in a way that transforms the economy positively without leaving Americans behind.
So as the Democratic Party begins reimagining capitalism, and the Republican Party to some extent as well, a new book argues that modern capitalism is a distant memory from the system's origins. The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies, and the Death of Competition by investor and freelance journalist Jonathan Tepper traces the framework's roots, and he notes that capitalism has been the greatest system in history to lift people out of poverty and create wealth, but the capitalism we see today in the U.S. is a far cry from competitive markets. What we have today is a grotesque, deformed version of capitalism. Joining us to explain more on those themes is Jonathan himself. He is the founder of Variant Perception, a macroeconomics research group that caters to asset managers. Welcome, sir. Glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So basically, you're saying companies have gotten so big that they feel like they can treat their customers like crap, their workers like crap, and it's really created problems for all of us.
That's a pretty good summary of the thesis in the book. Now, clearly that's not true of every industry. There are many industries that are competitive, but unfortunately, for very large parts of the U.S. economy, what we've seen over the last 40 years, and particularly accelerating in the last 20 years, is increasing concentration. So in many industries, if you think of sort of the Sweet 16 with basketball, we've had merger wave after merger wave, and so you go from 16 to 8 to 4. And in many industries, you now have very few players. And this is also true at a local level. And we know that when you end up with a lot more concentration with fewer employers, you end up with less bargaining power for workers. And this in part explains why workers' wages have stagnated. It also explains why some industries and companies have been able to raise prices consistently. We've seen this particularly in the medical and insurance industry. And it also leads to less investment where companies use the excess cash to buy back shares rather than necessarily invest. So it has a wide variety of adverse social consequences.
So, Jonathan, I think the central question from where we have, everybody generally agrees that the system currently doesn't work right now. Now, we can either go down the path that you're advocating for, which is, well, the policy implications of what you're advocating for is breaking up firms and increasing competition, or state-backed and subsidized industries that can compete on the global market against industrial behemoths like China. Why is the latter thing that I mentioned not the way to go?
Well, I mean, that's a rather absurd argument in the sense that what they're saying is if you have monopolies abroad, you then need to have monopolies at home. And clearly, the answer is more competition, not less. So just because another country has a misguided policy domestically doesn't mean that we should pursue the same misguided policy.
But when that policy has global implications, right? So Chinese telecommunications companies like Huawei being able to move in, undercut price, take over a European market, that has national security implications, that has strategic implications. So why would it not be in the U.S. interest, say, to subsidize an AT&T that was able to do the same thing?
Well, unfortunately, the United States actually doesn't even have any businesses that really compete with Huawei when it comes to technology infrastructure. You really are looking at European companies, which are the competitors. So the U.S. Gave that up quite a long time ago. But if you're looking at, for example, the argument that's often made is that you have dominant companies like Tencent in China and others, and therefore the U.S. needs a Google or a Facebook because there are other large dominant companies. And clearly large platforms have feedback loops, and so therefore often they are very big. But I think that the key is to make sure that they don't have anti-competitive conduct in the United States. I don't think it's essentially the argument that sort of two rights might make a wrong.
Jonathan, let me ask you about a specific example here and play devil's advocate for a moment. So Amazon, right, is a behemoth. They're buying up more and more companies. They take up a huge amount of the online sales space, the advertising space. People like Amazon. I like Amazon. The prices are cheap. Consumers could say it's really good for us. So why should this be broken up when consumers feel that they benefit from it?
Certainly. So the problem with Amazon specifically is that it essentially is a platform for third-party sellers. So that's about half of its revenue. And the other half is products and goods that Amazon sells itself. And Amazon, because it controls the platform, is able to favor its own goods. It's able to go straight to manufacturers and cut out sellers. And they have a tremendous amount of market power because they control that platform. And so the argument that Warren is making, and that I think makes sense, is that if you control the platform, you shouldn't be able to discriminate in favor of your own goods versus other people's goods. So FedEx and UPS, for example, they and many other industries in the United States have essentially what are called common carrier provisions, where if I offer to ship a package for you, I can't then discriminate against other people who are sending similar packages.
So what other companies and industries do you feel are most in need of increased competition and therefore government intervention?
Well, everyone fixates on the tech giants, partly because they're exciting and they have grown very rapidly. But the truth is, if you look at healthcare and insurance in the United States, that's about 1/5 of the entire GDP. And that is something that affects people's lives much more, and it's much more lacking in competition. So if you look at the urban hospital market, 90% of it's highly concentrated. And if you look at insurance markets around the US, basically about 37 states have the top 2 insurers completely dominating the market. And so there's very little competition, and I think that explains in part why there are much higher healthcare costs in the US than any other developed country. So a dose of competition would go a very long way.
Why has this massive concentration happened now? What has changed or in the world or in our regulatory environment? What has changed that has led to this?
So merger waves typically follow stock market booms. And in the early 1980s, they changed their rules for mergers, and they allowed companies to buy competitors. So you fast forward to today, we're almost 40 years later, and we've had essentially 4 big merger waves. So you had the merger wave in the 1980s. Everyone's seen the movie Wall Street, which is about merger tips. Then you had the massive merger wave in the late 1990s, which was the internet boom. Then the merger wave leading into the financial crisis of '07, and now we're at the 4th merger wave, which has been absolutely massive. And so that's when I describe the Sweet 16, essentially the narrowing down of competitors, where you go from quite a lot to very few. And essentially, we're at the tail end of a 4th mega merger wave.
So, Jonathan, which of the candidates right now is best advocating for the policies that are implicated from your book?
So I think Warren, by far, has been the one that has led on this issue, and she was talking about it before it was the hot topic of the day. I think that a lot of her proposals are very sensible when it comes to antitrust specifically. I wouldn't comment necessarily on the other elements of the plan, but I certainly do believe that we have to undo past mergers that reduce competition and then prevent future mergers from happening. And when it comes to the digital giants, we have to make sure that the platforms can't essentially benefit themselves and their own products at the expense of users, which is exactly sort of what's happened with Google favoring its own commercial search results. I don't think that there's any bias politically, Google favoring left or right, but rather they do certainly favor their own results over others when it comes to the commercial activities.
How has the Trump administration been on the issue of mergers and industry consolidation?
Well, the sad truth is it doesn't really matter what president is in office, whether it's Democrat or Republican, or even what they say on the campaign trail. The sad truth is that merger activity in the United States is essentially dead in terms of merger review by FTC and DOJ. And Trump talked a good game on the campaign trail, but basically he's appointed the same revolving cast of characters. And what you have is the K Street lawyers in D.C., and then economists from like Charles Rivers Associates and Compass Lexicon, and all of them essentially move in and out of government. And there hasn't really been any change under Trump.
So, final question for you, Jonathan. What needs to be changed in order to reinstitute merger reviews? Would it have to be an act of Congress? Would it require the administration to come into the DOJ and re-implement new policy? What specifically needs to be done?
So the merger guidelines were changed in the early 1980s, and they could be changed again if the DOJ and the White House wanted to. I think it's highly unlikely that would be the case, and I think that unfortunately it will require an act of Congress to specify what the Sherman and Clayton Act should be. I think that would be a good thing, and I think that The proposals that I recommend are essentially bright lines, meaning that there should be certain levels of concentration above which mergers shouldn't be approved. And I think that simple, clear tests are the way forward, rather than having even greater discretion left to the hands of unelected bureaucrats.
All right, Jonathan, thank you so much. Really interesting.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.
We're going to have more Rising after this.